Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith, and yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 195. Before we get to today's guest, I want to put in a plug for an upcoming conference for bereaved parents in Lynchburg, Virginia. The Our Hearts, Our Home conference is scheduled for April 12 through 13, 2024, and includes an amazing panel of speakers, several of whom have been guests on this podcast. Gary and Laura House, Melanie D. Simone, Carol Brown, Hal and Elizabeth Barge, Lisa Thacker and her husband Kirk, along with a number of other amazing speakers. You can participate either in person or online, and registration information is available at ourheartsourhome.org/conference, and I will also put that link in the show notes. The cost is very affordable, and there are even scholarships available if you're in need of that. I am pleased to welcome a return guest to the podcast today, Austin DeArmond. You may remember Austin and his wife Valerie from episodes number 176 and 177 when they shared the story of their beautiful son Gabriel, who went to heaven in January of 2023, just a day after his first birthday. Austin is a gifted writer and theologian and speaks with great honesty from his own personal experience of loss. He recently completed a series of essays on his blog about 20 common myths and cliches of grief, and we'll be discussing those over the next couple of episodes. I believe you'll find our conversation to be both educational and edifying. Hi, Austin. Thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, you have a blog that I love to follow because it's just so rich. It's got a very simple title, Austin's Blog, easy to remember. But at the end of October last year, you started a series of posts titled Myths and Cliches of Grief. And as I read the first installment, I knew I had to invite you back to the podcast to talk about these things that are so prevalent in our Western culture today. So I've been patiently waiting for you to finish the series, which you wrapped up, I think, on the 1st of January. And now that you have, I'm so excited to discuss these issues with you. But first, what motivated you to begin writing this series of posts?
Well, obviously, the heavenly homecoming of Gabriel is the most important factor. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a vociferous reader. And so I've been reading just about anything and everything I can get on child loss, on what God does in suffering, on grief. And as I've read it, you just come across things that sometimes are somewhat neutral. And then other times, I walked away reading something thinking, man, this is not helpful at all. And if I were to go into this and believe in this, I think it would actually make this whole process of grief really difficult. Child loss it's already devastating, debilitating, and downright destructive. The DSM manual talks about it being a catastrophic stressor. You feel like you're on a raft in an ocean and Mount Everest has been thrown in beside you. And so it's already difficult. You taste the sadness, you feel it in the bones, it's between your teeth. And I think that you can increase the difficulty and increase the pain if you attempt to prop yourself up with anything other than the truth. And I actually think a lot of these myths and cliches can even stunt the growth process. And so it was really self-reflection and conversations with Valerie and even other bereaved parents. And then I thought, well, this may be helpful to other people. And so I started writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why when I started to read it, I just knew I wanted to have you on to talk about these things because, you can have an idea of what grief is. And I think a lot of that is formed by our culture. And then when you find yourself in grief after the loss of a child, like you said, has such a profound impact. All of that just kind of goes out the window and you really don't know how to deal with grief. And so many of those myths and cliches, like you said, are so hurtful and are unhelpful at best
Yeah.
when you're grieving. And doing what we do, meeting bereaved parents all the time, talking to them at retreats, talking to them online, we hear a lot of these myths and cliches stated. And I just think it's so important to discuss them and talk about what you said, what truth really is. And so that's why I'm so excited for us to chat.
Yeah, me too.
You've been a guest on the podcast before. And for those who are listening that may want to hear a little bit more of Austin and Valerie's story, I invite you to go back and listen to episodes number 176 and 177. Their story is well worth listening to. But we've got so much to cover today. I want to jump right into these myths and cliches. And I want you to start out by just defining grief. What is grief?
Absolutely. So I read a book called Lament for a Son, even
Yes.
before Gabriel passed, and obviously since he's passed, by a Christian philosopher named Nicholas Wolterstorff. And he says, grief is the existential testimony to the worth of the one loved. And I think that's a wonderful definition. I went a little further and said grief is the social, emotional, physical, spiritual, and psychological response of the soul to losing something or someone that you love so dearly. So grief is the sort of response, and then mourning is what you do with that grief. How do you express that grief? And so that would be the difference between, I'd say, grief and mourning.
Yeah, yeah. And that's interesting because I never really have thought about that there is a difference between grief and mourning, but indeed there is. So one of the cliches, and this is something that I've heard all my life, time heals all wounds. Talk about that.
Well, that's certainly not true. Time alone can't fix anything. It doesn't have any causative ability to it. The God of time heals all wounds. God does the work of healing within people. And sometimes the healing is not immediate. Healing is more of a process, and it's a process that I feel for bereaved parents obviously starts in this life, but it may not have its full end until eternity. Someone said that some things can't be fixed, they just must be carried. And
Mm.
some things can't be rectified, outside of a resurrection. And I feel like child loss is one of those things that fits in that category. And so time alone can't do anything. God has to do the difficult work of healing. And then, in this myth, there's almost this idea that the flow of time, it passes, and then you just sort of passively receive it and it gets better over time. But I think healing, especially healing in the midst of grief, is hard work. And unless someone leans into their grief and does that hard work, of course, time will do nothing. Jerry Sitzer, who lost his daughter, his wife, and his mother in a car wreck in one moment, said the quickest way for anyone to reach the sun in the light of the day is not to run west, chasing after the setting sun, but to run east, plunging into the darkness until one comes to the sunrise. And so the only way to sort of have any measure of healing as the Lord is working on you is to lean into that grief and to do that hard work. And over time, I feel like the pain gets softer. That's, as one sweet lady in Grief Share said to us so often, the pain gets softer. It's still there, but it's almost like you grow around it and it gets somewhat easier to carry. It's still there. The hole in our heart from Gabriel is just as big as it was on January 21st, but we've grown around it and we can carry it in a different way now.
Yes. Yeah. I can relate to all of that you just said. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Another myth is that moving forward is disloyalty to my loved one. And I've met so many people who feel that way. How is that not true? Explain that for us.
Yeah. So we even recently have started the process of adoption again. And there's a part of me that says, if it's not Gabriel, I don't want it. And under that is the sort of sense of disloyalty. But, the reality is we don't have the past. You can't live in the past. All you have is the present and the future. And so if you stay in the past and have these feelings of disloyalty, you can get stuck. And so we've talked about this before, and I've heard it from you and out of the mouths of others. We're not moving on. We're moving forward towards our
Yes.
children in heaven. And so, and it encourages me if we feel, like we're being disloyal, which I don't think is actual. They certainly don't feel that way. There is no sin in heaven. There is no bitterness. There is no hardship. There is no sadness. Any tears that have been wept in heaven have been personally wiped away by the Lord Jesus himself. And so they're not holding a grudge. They're probably
Right.
not even thinking about us. They're
Exactly.
enjoying things that we can't even think or comprehend. And so when I think about loyalty, what does it mean to be loyal to our children who have gone on ahead of us? I think that means you live well. You honor them through how you move forward and move toward them. You honor their legacy. I heard one writer say that bereaved parents, they're still parents. They haven't lost their children. They've lost out on the ability to raise their children. The Lord Jesus is I don't know metaphysically how that works, but the Lord's taking care of them. But we are stewards of our children. We're stewards of their legacy now that they're in eternity. And so, what does it mean to be loyal to children who have gone on ahead of us? It means to be a good steward of their legacy. It means to live well and live worthy lives. It means you don't give up living because they're now living in heaven. And so, loyalty in life meant you loved them, you protected them, you taught them, you served them, you honored them. And so, loyalty in death means, man, you keep living, you keep stewarding that legacy. You keep talking about them, you keep remembering them. And so, I don't think it's disloyalty to move forward. And again, we're moving toward them, not away from them.
Absolutely. Nancy Guthrie has a quote, and I'm probably not going to quote it exactly the way she said it, but the gist of it is, my love for my child is not defined by my ongoing misery.
Mm.
And that always stuck with me because I think so many parents can get stuck there, where they just feel like they have to be miserable because they have lost their child.
Yeah.
And that's how they show that loyalty. And so I appreciate the fact that you've addressed that and addressed that so well. All right, another one of our myths that we're going to talk about is progress means taking steps forward, but never steps back.
Yeah. Grief is uncharted, it's unexpected, it's untamable. There is no linear model for it. I mean, life is messy and so is grief. And I think a part of this myth has to do with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. But when you go back to that original groundbreaking work on death and dying that she wrote in the late 60s, she met with cancer patients at the end of their life and tried to sort of describe what they're going to. She presented it to her students, and then it became this bestseller. She never intended to give a sort of stage model when it comes to grief, and has even said in later works that was never my intention. We are always in process, going back, going forward. For bereaved parents, some days are better than others. Some times of the day are better than others. The rawness and numbness, it wears off, and you're settling into this new life without your beloved child, but it's always difficult. It's always messy. And that's just a part of being human. And so I think if you have this metric of this is what progress looks like, and you put that on yourself, I think that can create undue pain, especially when you look around and see other bereaved parents and think, well, they're further along than me. And it's like, well, no, beloved, you're a human and you're in process. Our relationship with the Lord is unique. And so even our relationship in grief is going to be unique. And so I don't think it's always moving forward. This past year and a couple months proves that's certainly not true for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is reassuring for people to realize that the grief journey to me is maybe 3 steps forward and 2 steps back.
Absolutely.
And then 1 step forward and 4 steps back. And then 6 steps forward and 3 steps back. That's just normal. That's a normal part of the grief journey.
Yeah. And obviously certain days are more difficult. They're heaven day, they're death day, holidays.
Absolutely.
We thought through holidays, and then it didn't occur to me to think through New Year's. I don't know why I didn't think that. So New Year's actually felt worse than Christmas. And so and some days are more difficult, and the progress, like you said, it's messy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very messy and definitely not linear.
Yeah. And can I say this too?
Absolutely.
Gabriel was so close to walking. And I remember him holding onto the couch and walking along with the couch. And there was this immense sense of pride in those little steps. And that is certainly how the Lord views his children. We focus on the fact that we took 3 steps and we fell on the ground. I think the Lord focuses on the fact that, man, we took 3 steps. And child loss is likely one of the hardest and heaviest things, the heaviest cross to pick up. And so I think the Lord is proud when we make progress, and we make progress by leaning on him, just like you'd be proud of that baby taking those steps.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful visual. Thank you for sharing that. All right, another myth. The lessening of pain indicates a lessening of love.
Yeah. I don't think anything will ever cause me to lessen my love for my son. As long as I have breath in my lungs, and even when I don't, in the life after this life, I think I'll always love him. The lessening of pain just means you're growing. You're relying on the Lord, and the Lord is working. It doesn't mean I've grown to love him any less. C.S. Lewis talks about in A Grief Observed, which is, his personal diary after his wife, Joy Davidson, died from cancer. He talked about, this sense of getting over it. Like, there is no getting over it. And then you grow, but you're always different. He
Right.
uses the language of, I'll have a wooden leg for the rest of my life. I'll never again be a biped, meaning I'll never again have two functioning legs. All of life has changed. And so I don't think that your love lessens, as you sort of grow around it. In fact, again, I think my love and my longing for him is greater today than even before. There may be less pain, but we've still been torn in two.
Yes.
He's the son of my right arm. And so, of course, I'm going to love him forever, even if that scar tissue has grown around the nub.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can relate to that from my experience as well. I really feel like I love Hannah more
Oh, yeah.
now than I did even when she was here with us in our home. And I like that. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a very positive thing. But like you said, the pain is not as great as it was either from when she first left. So,
and I think as I think about Gabe, obviously we were so grateful for his arrival. We did not think we could get pregnant. He just as like our daughter was a child of gratitude. But it's almost like since we've lost him, his characteristics and his beauty has been magnified. So of course, your love grows with that. I don't think bereaved parents love their children less. I think they probably love them more since they've passed on and gone on before them.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. All right, another myth. God took something or someone from me that I cannot live without. And I know a lot of bereaved parents just feel like they cannot live without their child. So talk about that.
Yeah. And I resonate with the feeling of that.
Yes, me
Those
too.
first 3 months, the pain and the emotion was so intense. And you thought, man, the only way to get relief from this is to go to sleep. And so I resonate with the feeling that I can't go on without them. But thinking theologically, only God is truly essential and necessary. It's a part of God's attributes that he's a necessary being, meaning he can't not exist. He's the creator, we're the creature. He's independent, we're dependent. He's free, we're radically contingent. The reality is only he alone is necessary. Our very existence is derivative. And so what that means is we can actually lose all sorts of things and still go on, because the only thing that is necessary is God and God alone. But I love this quote from Wendell Berry. He said, "The living can't quit living because the world has turned terrible and people they love and need are killed. They can't because they don't. The light that shines into darkness and never goes out calls them on into life. It calls them back again into the great room. It calls them into their bodies and into the world, into whatever the world will require. It calls them into work and pleasure, goodness and beauty in the company of other loved ones." And so you feel like you can't go on, but the reality is you will. And in
Right.
a lot of ways, you must. And the fact that we're alive today is evidence that we can, in fact, go on without our loved ones, however terribly painful it is. And at this point, this is where meeting and fellowshipping with other bereaved parents matters so much. Because I look at you and Brad and other bereaved parents, and I think, man, they're 17 years out, or they're 30 years out, or they're 20 years out, and they're radiant, they're beautiful, they're Christ-like. If they can make it, we can make it. And so
That's right.
I think you got to be in this sort of sacred circle of sorrow that Tim Challies talks about, and that brings help as you feel like you can't go on.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can look at people who are ahead of you,
Hmm.
and it shows you that you can survive, that you can It's not easy. It's painful, like you said, but we can live without our children. And we can hang on to that knowledge that we will see them again.
Yeah.
That helps. All right. The next one is one that I have heard over and over and over throughout my life. And I honestly don't know if there's another myth that has caused more pain and more frustration, maybe, than this one. God will never give you more than you can handle.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
And I heard this well before Gabriel went to
Sure.
heaven. I think it's just one of those Christian myths that get repeated. It's on Hallmark cards. I was listening to a country song the other day, and the line was, "God won't make a mountain that I can't climb." It gets better and better all the time. And so this is just demonstrably false. And I think a part of this, the popularity of this myth, is the nature of us living in the West. We are very inundated with ideas of individualism, freedom, autonomy. Children learn from a very young age. You can do whatever you want and be whatever you want. You just have to dream. And there's a measure of truth to that, but it is not true that God will never give us more than we can handle. I mean, the reality is God will never give us more than he can handle.
Right.
And he regularly puts us into situations that require us to look outside of ourselves, bankrupting ourselves of our own strength, our own wisdom, and rely solely on him. I think about the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 1. He talks about the God of comfort comforting us so that he can in turn comfort others with the comfort that God provides. And the Apostle Paul, who's this hero of the faith, talks about suffering in Asia, and he despaired even of life. And why did he do that? Why did God permit that, allow that? So that he wouldn't rely on himself, but on the God who raises the dead. And so, we see examples from cover to cover in Scripture and in church history and in our own lives of the Lord constantly giving us things that we cannot handle on our own. And trying to handle things on our own is what got Adam and Eve in trouble in the beginning. And it's what gets me in trouble today.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not our sense of, dependency that's the issue. It's our sense of self-sufficiency. I think I have the strength to do this, and so I attempt to handle it on my own apart from the Lord, and I fail every single time. Isaiah 64:4 says, God works for those who wait for him. And I think that's the truth of the scriptures is, God will never give you more than he can handle. I cannot handle child loss on my own.
Mm-hmm.
We've said often, how can anyone make it putting their child in that little casket apart from the grace and the presence and the mercy of God? And I just don't understand. And so this is not a helpful thing to believe in general, but it's most certainly not a helpful thing to believe when you're going through catastrophic loss and suffering.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that and just kind of fleshing that out, because I know there are so many people who struggle with that.
Yeah.
And it's just helpful to know that is a myth.
Yeah.
That is a myth. All right, here's another one. God is sovereign, so it does not matter what happened to someone.
Whew, yeah. So let me say that the sovereignty of God has been something about God's character that has encouraged us likely the most.
Yes.
The sovereignty of God and the tenderness and mercy of God. The sovereignty of God is less of a sledgehammer and more of a pillow for someone who's suffering. That being said, if the sovereignty of God is ever used to mute or discount human responsibility or accountability, you can be sure that the doctrine is misunderstood and being misapplied. The scriptures teach both the exhaustive sovereignty of God over all things, as well as the exhaustive human accountability in all things for their choices. What this looks like. Nobody's ever going to say God is sovereign, so human accountability is superfluous or something crazy like that. They're just going to say God had a purpose in your pain as you're weeping, which is true, but it's almost like that precious doctrine of sovereignty is being used to mute the pain that you're feeling. And in thinking about sovereignty and responsibility, the sovereignty of God grounds our responsibility. It does not neuter or remove it. And so you can hold two difficult truths together
Yes.
without them contradicting one another. And the scriptures do that when it comes to human volition and divine sovereignty. Neither one has to be denied.
Mm. Yeah, and I think we have a tendency to do that. It's hard for us to grasp the idea of having two difficult truths like that, holding them both at the same time. And again, I think it kind of comes back to that Western culture. We just want a quick answer. We want something easy and just kind of move on. And these are weighty things to grapple with.
Absolutely.
The sovereignty of God and the free will of man there's a mystery to it that we will not understand on this side of earth or on this side of heaven. But
Yeah. And
yeah,
mystery isn't contradiction.
exactly.
As
Exactly.
Christians, we do not affirm contradiction. God is a God of truth, but we wholeheartedly believe in mystery.
Mm,
God has not told us everything. And I remember a line from J.I. Packer in his book, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God. You know, we may disagree where we stand when it comes to sovereignty and freedom, but we agree when we hit our knees and we pray.
mm,
And we pray to a sovereign God who holds people accountable, who works in and with and through and among people. They don't have to be reconciled because they're friends. They're not enemies.
mm. Very good. Yeah, thank you for that. All right, here's another one. You should be over it after a year. And I have to say, I probably thought that was true myself before I found myself in the situation where we lost our daughter. I assumed that other people who lost children were probably over it, really kind of within a few months, even maybe, that they'd be really, really sad for a while, but then within a few months, surely within a year, they'd be over it. But you say that's a myth, and I believe it is a myth. I've experienced in my own life. So talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it goes back to our cultural context living in the West. I do a lot of work overseas, and the mourning practices that you see in other culture are, I think, profoundly more helpful than what we've kind of allowed ourselves in the West. We don't even wear black clothes to funerals anymore.
Right.
We tell people at our funeral, "Don't you cry, don't you weep over me. I want you to celebrate me." And it's like, well, no. I mean, this is a sad thing. You can do both. I intended to love my son for a lifetime.
Mm,
I dearly and deeply and desperately love him right now, and I will continue loving him in the life after this life, the life that lays after my dying. And so, if his worth was such that it was immeasurable, and grief is a response to that worth, 365 days isn't gonna do anything magical.
no.
Dr. Brad Hambrick says grief is the celebration of a good gift from God through tears. And so I intend to celebrate Gabriel through tears and through laughter and through honoring and stewarding his legacy until I see him again.
Yeah.
And so I don't think the year mark, I don't think that's fair, especially when others think it or imply it or feel it. I mean, H. Norman Wright, he passed away last year. He's a grief counselor. He said, in terms of child loss, a lot of times it takes up to 7 to 8 years for
Yes.
bereaved parents to feel a sense of stability again.
Right.
And I mean, he's an expert in grief, and so
Yeah.
1 year is not enough. I intend to celebrate that good gift of Gabriel for the rest of my life until we get to celebrate again together.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I've heard that H. Norman Wright quote before too, and it was reassuring to me to hear
Yeah.
that, to think, wow, I am not abnormal. That after 5, 6, 7 years, and in our case now 15 years,
Mm.
we're normal, and it's okay to still be grieving. Like you said, we're
Yeah.
going to grieve Hannah until we see her again. That doesn't mean we don't have joy, because we absolutely do.
Mm.
But that grief, I believe, will remain for a lifetime,
Yeah.
in a different intensity, but certainly it will remain. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Our children are worthy of that.
Yeah.
So here's one I hear all the time, even among fellow grievers. And I think it's because people haven't actually just kind of thought it through.
Yeah.
And here's the statement: there are no right or wrong ways to grieve.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I have seen this, especially in resources that are not from a Christian perspective, secular
Right.
grief resources, which I think can be 100% helpful. All truth is God's truth. And so if it's true, it's helpful. But I think if we think practically and we think just simply that this is not true, if you're hurting and harming yourself, that's not a helpful way to grieve. If you're repressing and ignoring your grief, that's not a helpful way to grieve. It's going to blow up. It's like pushing that inflatable under a pool or under the water in a
Right.
pool. It's going to
Uh-huh.
pop up and the splash is going to be immense. If you're harming others and you're lashing out at others, I don't know that that's helpful. Our loved ones are so patient and forgiving if we do that. And I love that. That's them persevering in love for us. But that doesn't make what we're doing acceptable.
Right.
I can't. I want to be honest here. One of my favorite movies is still Magnolias, and Sally Field's response after she buries her daughter at the end, and she's losing it, and
Yeah.
they say, "Hit Weezer," they laugh about it. But I mean, if you're taking out your pain on others, then that's not helpful.
That's right.
And so I think just at a human level, obviously we all recognize there are unhelpful ways to grieve. If I'm going down I-10 doing 105 because I'm weeping over my son at 11:30 at night, I'm endangering myself, I'm endangering others, and I'm not being a good steward of everything the Lord has given me in that moment. But even as Christians, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4 that we don't grieve as those without hope. And so even Christian grieving is different.
Mm.
And there is Christian grief. When the martyr Stephen went to heaven in Acts chapter 7, it says they raised up great lamentation over him. It's okay to grieve as
Yes.
Christians. King David grieved over Saul, and Saul was a hot mess express. And so grieving is appropriate. But even our grief as Christians is molded and contoured by the great realities of Scripture. And so I have thought about this year as I have grieved. It has been real. It has been genuine. It has been sincere. But I also am cognizant of the fact that I have people watching,
Mm.
and they're seeing me pick up that cross. And it would be wrong if I communicated in my grief that this wasn't a cross, that this cross doesn't matter, that the God who gave me that cross is somehow less than good and righteous and true and sovereign. And so I think even as Christians, there's wrong ways to grieve in our sorrow, and we need to be aware of that. And I mean, that's something I had to think through. I want to be genuine. I want to be sincere. I want to pay attention to my emotions and what I'm feeling, but I also want to remember the truths that I've banked my life on out of great admiration and respect for the one who saved my life. And I think that's true for all believers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's bandied around so much. There's no right way or wrong way to grieve. And there are right ways and wrong ways. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that. This concludes the first half of my conversation about common myths and cliches of grief with Austin DeArmond. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join us as we discuss 10 more myths and cliches next Wednesday.